Welcome back. I'm joined again by Tawfiq Rangwala. We're discussing his book, What We Lost Inside the Attack on Canada's Largest Children's Charity. Thank you again for joining me. Before we went to commercial break, we were discussing how this really was it was a political issue, but potentially We Charity got just snarled into it. There was a lot of political capital lost from the Liberals, primarily. Justin Trudeau, I recall that they were after him to testify at the ethics committee. Our Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau, was caught up in all of this and actually resigned amidst all of these investigations. What was that all about?
Well, if you look at it, I mean, what the accusation was, right, against Trudeau and Bill Morneau was that they had ties to We Charity and that they had, appeared on the stage at We Charity events. They visited We Charity projects internationally, at least in the case of Morneau. And I think the allegation was, they were too close. And the issue really for politicians was, should those members of cabinet have recused themselves from the decision to award this contract to We Charity? And what I point out in the book is I think many people sort of maligned We Charity for that. But of course, We Charity had no visibility into whether these people recused themselves. We Charity assumed that if they needed to recuse themselves, they had done so. It never even entered the mind of We Charity to try and get involved in the government's policing of its own conflicts of interest. It was sort of like We Charity, as Kim Campbell says in the introduction to the book, of the foreword, We Charity thought it was called to serve. And it felt compelled because its raison d'etre was putting young people together with volunteering opportunities. That's what it did for 25 years in Canada. That's why it was celebrated. It felt compelled to serve. It never felt that it was its job to sort of police whether the government was doing everything it was supposed to do, or whether there was some invitation to criticize the government for how it was, awarding the program. We Charity was focused on just doing the work. And, Tanya, what was really interesting politically in this story was, for me, what happened is a lot of politicians, it wasn't enough to have a scandal, an ethics scandal in the Trudeau government, if We Charity was a good actor. I mean, if the Liberal government was giving the money, let's just say to Mother Teresa or some other revered figure, but it cut corners on ethics rules, that's really not enough of a scandal. To make it a scandal and really question Trudeau's judgment, you had to make We Charity in some way a bad actor. It had to be a problem to award administration to this organization. And I think that's where politicians, really deeply unfairly, I think, on both sides of the spectrum, and the media following suit, took up an invitation to sort of tar We Charity, criticize the founders of We Charity, sort of look at them with a critical lens, and losing sight of the real political problem, mostly because the politicians wanted to make it about how could you, the Trudeau government, give money to this organization, right? It only works. It's only a scandal if you gave money to something sinister.
Now, you mentioned in your book that I'll call it an alleged We Charity scandal, for lack of a better phrase. This was percolating before we even knew about it, perhaps before even the politicians knew about it, that there was a media influence that kind of brought this to the forefront. Are you able to discuss what that was all about? Because many of us have no idea about that.
Well, look, I think that, We Charity and the Kielburgers, the Craig and Mark Kielburger who founded it, I think have always been media darlings in Canada for almost 25 years. I mean, they very much, been celebrated for a lot of their achievements and for what they've done in the Canadian charitable landscape. And one of the really interesting elements of this story, what makes it interesting, whatever side of the equation you come out on, is just how quickly they turned into pariahs, how quickly the Canadian public, media, and politicians all turned on them. And I think, there had always been media outlets, mostly fringe players, heavily focused on social media, that have been critical of We Charity and asked questions about it, or raised all sorts of skepticism and doubt about it. And those have been addressed. From my perspective as a board member, all of those kinds of concerns have always been addressed. And if they were fair, they were taken into account, and if they were unfair, they were rebutted. But really, the mainstream media really had never focused in a critical way on We Charity. And I think what happened here is there was a bit of what I call piling on, where people became much more interested in the questions and not very interested in the answers. And there was a tendency to report smoke and then decide it's not really worth telling your viewers whether there's fire. And I think it was a real failure in my mind of investigative journalism. where I think a lot of mainstream media started taking their cues from social media players and fringe players, and then reporting their narrative as the story, as opposed to sort of asking hard questions. Is the story fair? Is it justified? And
Right.
more importantly, to the title of my book, are the losses and what's been lost, is it worth it? And is it just? And
Right.
I think people ignored those questions.
Okay, we're going to pick up this discussion in just a few moments.